Welcome to my channel.
The wind screamed down the glen, a high-pitched, keening wail that rattled the sash windows of the Lochdu police station, as if trying to claw its way inside. It was the kind of mid-December Highland weather that suggested nature held a personal grudge against humanity. Rain, laced with icy sleet, lashed sideways, turning the view of the loch into a smear of hostile grey. Inside the kitchen of the police cottage, however, a fragile peace reigned. PC Hamish Macbeth was engaged in his favourite police activity, aggressively ignoring the telephone. It sat on the scratched pine table, ringing with the insistent shrill tone adopted by Strathbane headquarters when Detective Chief Inspector Blair was on the warpath. Hamish, a tall, gangling figure with flaming red hair and eyes the colour of wet moss, stared at the instrument balefully over the rim of a chipped mug filled with black coffee. "Let it ring, lugs," Hamish muttered to the small, indeterminate terrier curled by the peat stove. Lugs opened one eye, gave a snort that sounded distinctly cynical, and went back to sleep. Hamish knew exactly what the call was about. It was nearly Christmas, and Blair would be wanting numbers. Arrest statistics, parking ticket quotas, breathalyzer reports, all the bureaucratic nonsense that city policemen concerned themselves with. Hamish had none of these things. What he did have was a very fine 10-pound salmon concealed beneath a tarp in his colsht, a fish that had, until last night, been enjoying the hospitality of the laird's private stretch of the river. He also had a stew simmering slowly on the stove, filling the kitchen with the comforting scent of venison and root vegetables. If he answered the phone, Blair would shout. If Blair shouted, Hamish's digestion would suffer. Therefore the phone must remain unanswered. It was a simple matter of self-preservation. Eventually the ringing stopped, replaced by the heavy silence of the snow-threatened glen. Hamish sighed, a long sound of contentment that seemed to irritate Lugs. The peace, Hamish knew, was temporary. In Lochdu, peace always was. It was usually shattered either by a sheep stuck in a cattle grid or by someone from England arriving to tell them they were doing everything wrong. Feeling the need for intelligence gathering, which was his preferred term for gossiping while scrounging food, Hamish donned his heavy police greatcoat, pulled his peaked cap low against the wind, and ventured out. Lugs, deciding that loyalty had its limits when faced with sleet, refused to budge from the stove. The village of Lochdu huddled at the head of the loch, a small collection of whitewashed cottages and hardy stone buildings that seemed to cling to the edge of the world. Today, smoke was whipped horizontally from chimney pots. The only other soul braving the elements was Mrs. Wellington, the postmistress, who was battling her way towards the village shop, her umbrella turned inside out like a skeletal black flower. Hamish intercepted her, adopting his best posture of slow-witted amiability. "A wild day, Mrs. Wellington," he shouted over the wind. Mrs. Wellington, a woman whose natural expression suggested she had just smelled bad fish, glared at him. "Wild? It's an abomination, Hamish Macbeth. And speaking of abominations, have you seen him?" Hamish blinked slowly. "Him? That Sassenach peacock down at the hotel, shouting about development opportunities and demanding oat milk for his latte. As if Mr. Patel at the shop even knows what an oat looks like before it's porridge." Mrs. Wellington wrestled with her ruined umbrella. "He's parked a car the size of a tank right across the harbour slipway. If old Archie wants to get his boat out, he'll have to torpedo the thing." "Aye, well," Hamish said soothingly. "The tourists do like the view. He's no tourist, Hamish. He says he's here to stay. Says he's buying the Maccrimmon estate to build eco-lodges for rich Londoners who want to experience the authentic wild." She spat the words out as if they were poison. "He'll be authenticitying us all out of house and home by Hogmanay." Hamish felt a familiar heaviness settle in his gut, and it wasn't the coffee. The Maccrimmon estate, been tied up in probate for years since old Angus died without a will. It was a vast tract of bog and heather that the locals used freely for grazing, and occasionally hunting things they strictly shouldn't. A developer meant fences. Fences meant trouble. "I'm sure it's just talk, Mrs. Wellington," Hamish lied, trying to sound bovine and unconcerned. "These rich folk usually blow away with the first good gale. Not this one. He's got eyes like a cash register and a voice like a foghorn. You'd best get down there, Hamish. He's upsetting people." Mrs. Wellington marched off, leaving Hamish with his duty. With a heavy sigh, he turned towards the Lochdu Hotel. The bar of the hotel was usually a sanctuary of quiet murmurs and the clink of glasses. Today, it felt like a pressure cooker. The air was thick with the smell of damp wool, stale beer, and expensive, cloying aftershave. At the centre of the room, holding court at the brass-railed bar, was a man who looked as if he had been dropped into the Highlands by a tailor on Savile Row who hated him. He wore a tweed suit that was too loud, a cashmere jumper that was too bright, and shoes that were far too polished for deer dung and mud. He was large, florid-faced, and currently booming at Rory, the hotel owner. Abysmal man. Simply abysmal selection. No single malt older than 12 years. What do you people drink when you want to actually taste something? The local fishermen and crofters dotted around the small tables were hunched over their pints, radiating a collective sullen hostility that was palpable enough to cut with a knife. Hamish drifted to the end of the bar, trying to make himself invisible. He caught Rory's eye and signalled for a half pint. The newcomer turned. His eyes, small and pale blue in a fleshy face, landing on Hamish's uniform. He looked Hamish up and down, taking in the slightly frayed collar and the mud on his boots. A sneer curled his lip. "Ah, the local constabulary arrives," the man announced to the room, his voice a braying upper-class English tenor that set Hamish's teeth on edge. "Did you catch the sheep stealer yet, officer? Or were you too busy napping in a haystack?" He extended a large soft hand. Jasper Finch Hatton, developer, visionary, soon to be the man who drags this godforsaken peat bog into the 21st century. Hamish took the hand. It felt like holding a damp sponge. He gave his best vacuous smile, letting his green eyes go slightly crossed. "Hamish Macbeth," he mumbled. "Just the village bobby, sir." "Right. Well, Bobby, perhaps you can tell these good people that progress is coming, whether they like it or not. I intended to buy old Archie's plot by the loch today, but the stubborn old goat won't even open his door to me. Imagine refusing £50,000 for a patch of soggy weeds. From the corner, a low growl emanated from where Archie McLean was nursing a whisky. Archie's family had crofted that land since before the Jacobite risings. Finch Hatton laughed, a sound devoid of humour. "No matter. I'll have the land by Christmas. Everyone has a price. These people just need to learn their place in the new order." He slapped a £50 note onto the bar, waving away his change from Rory as if coins were contaminated. "Keep the change, landlord. Buy some decent whiskey." Hamish leaned against the bar, sipping his half-pint, watching the man strut out into the howling wind to his illegally parked luxury car. He felt the tension in the room uncoil in the stranger's wake, replaced by a bitter, lingering resentment. Jasper Finch Hatton had been in Lochdu for less than 24 hours, and Hamish calculated that at least 6 people in the room already wanted to kill him. Hamish finished his drink slowly. The vision of his quiet evening by the fire with his stew was fading fast. He had a nasty feeling that this particular Christmas season was going to be far too interesting for his liking. He really should have answered that phone call from Blair. It might have been less painful than what was coming. Hamish woke to a world muffled by a treacherous layer of white. The sleet had died down during the small hours, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt heavy. He poked the dying embers of the peat fire, the smell of last night's venison stew still clinging pleasantly to the thick wool curtains. He had planned a day of utter stagnation. There was a dusty book on Highland folklore he'd been meaning to ignore, and the poached salmon in the coal shed needed a proper salting. But the universe rarely consulted his personal schedule. The knock at the door wasn't the sharp rap of the law, but the frantic thumping of someone who had seen something they wished they hadn't. It was Archie McLean. His face, usually the weathered colour of a well-worn brick, was a sickly shade of cold porridge. He was gasping for air, his breath blooming in the frozen Highland morning like white clouds of exhaust. "Hamish," he wheezed, clutching the doorframe. "The harbour. You've got to come now. It's that Sassenach fellow. He's in a bad way." Hamish felt a leaden weight sink into his boots. "Is he shouting again, Archie?" "Because if he's just being loud, it's not a police matter. It's a local tragedy." "He's no shouting, Hamish," Archie whispered, his eyes wide. "He's no doing much of anything. He's decorated, like a shop window in Strathbane." With a groan that started in his toes, Hamish retrieved his heavy police greatcoat. Lugs, sensing that his master was about to do something involving movement in the cold, slunk under the kitchen table with a whimper. "Come on, you lazy beast," Hamish commanded. "If I have to be miserable and frozen, so do." You. It's the law. The walk to the harbour was a trial of endurance. The path was slick with black ice, and the wind off the loch felt like a razor blade against his cheeks. A small crowd had already gathered near the ancient stone slipway, huddled together in dark oilskins. As Hamish approached, the low murmuring stopped instantly. They parted for him, their expressions a mixture of awe and a certain grim satisfaction. There, tied to the heavy iron ring used for mooring trawlers, was Jasper Finch Hatton. He was no longer wearing his expensive Savile Row tweed. Instead, someone had dressed him in a garish, oversized Santa Claus outfit, complete with a cheap nylon beard that the wind was whipping around his stiff neck. He was sitting upright against the freezing stone wall. But it was the positioning that was truly bizarre. In his lap sat a large, very dead and very frozen Atlantic salmon. His hands were bound with orange baling twine, and his mouth was stuffed with a sprig of prickly holly. His pale blue eyes were wide open, staring out at the grey waters of Loch Dhu with a look of permanent, icy surprise. Well, Hamish sighed, adjusting his cap. He did say he wanted the authentic Highland experience. I suppose he hadn't planned on the folk horror ending. He knelt beside the body, lugs sniffing cautiously at the dead man's shoes. The smell of high-end aftershave was still there, now competing with the briny scent of the loch and the metallic tang of blood. There was a dark frozen crust on the back of Finch Hatton's head, where it rested against the damp stone. A single heavy blow to the skull, efficient, if a bit messy. Hamish's irritation grew. This wasn't just a murder, it was a theatrical production designed to mock the victim and the police. And a theatrical production in Loch Dhu meant endless paperwork that would stretch well into the spring. He looked at the salmon. It was a fine fish, remarkably similar to the one resting in his own kolsht. The irony was not lost on him, nor would it be lost on the villagers. Someone in Loch Dhu had a sense of humour as dark as a winter midnight. "Right then," Hamish announced to the crowd, his voice thin against the gale. "I want everyone back in their homes. Archie, don't you be thinking of heading to the hotel for a dram yet. I'll need a statement. I just found him like that, Hamish. I was going to check my pots, and there he was, looking like a bad Christmas card. I'm sure. Now, move along." As the villagers dispersed, Hamish stood alone with the dead man and the dog. The piece of Loch Dhu was dead, murdered alongside the man who had tried to buy it. He could already hear the phantom roar of DCI Blair's voice in his head, screaming about incompetence and ruined holidays. Hamish pulled a small notebook from his pocket, his fingers stiff with the cold. This would be very hard work. Hamish stood by the frozen slipway, the wind whipping his red hair into a frantic tangle. He had covered the body with a tarpaulin borrowed from a nearby lobster crate, though the sight of a Santa-suited developer under a plastic sheet was hardly an improvement. Then he heard it, the wail of sirens bouncing off the hills, a sound that signalled the end of any remaining quietude. 2 police cruisers and a forensic van skidded around the corner of the harbour road, their tyres protesting against the icy slush. Before the lead car had even come to a full stop, the door flew open and Detective Chief Inspector Blair tumbled out, looking like a pressurised boiler about to burst its rivets. His face was a shade of purple that matched the Highland heather, and his breath came in ragged, angry puffs of steam. Behind him trailed the long-suffering detective Jimmy Anderson, who looked as though he would rather be anywhere else, preferably somewhere with a working radiator and a large glass of scotch. "Macbeth!" Blair roared, his voice echoing across the water and likely waking the seals. "What in the name of? God have you done now? I leave you alone for 10 minutes in this miserable sheep-dip of a village, and you manage to find a corpse dressed for a Christmas pantomime." He stomped over to the slipway, his polished city shoes slipping on the black ice. He grabbed the edge of the tarpaulin and yanked it back, recoiling slightly at the sight of the holly and the dead fish. "Is this some kind of sick joke? Are you trying to make a fool of the Strathbane CID, you ginger-haired peasant?" Hamish assumed his most vacuous expression, letting his jaw hang slightly slack. "I didn't dress him, sir. He was like that when Archie McLean found him. I was just keeping the peace, as is my duty." "Duty? You wouldn't know duty if it bit you on your bony backside." Blair spat, turning to look at the small huddle of villagers who were watching from a safe distance. Look at them, a pack of savages. I bet they all had a hand in this. It's a conspiracy, that's what it is. A Highland conspiracy against progress. He turned his attention back to the body, pointing a stubby, gloved finger at the salmon. And what's this? A clue? Or did you just decide to have a picnic while you waited for the real police to arrive? It's a salmon, Sir, Hamish said helpfully. A very fine one. Out of season, mind you. I know it's a salmon, Blair screamed. I'm not an idiot, Macbeth. Unlike some people I could mention. Anderson, get the cameras over here. I want every inch of this ridiculous spectacle recorded. And find me that McLean fellow. If he found the body, he's my prime suspect. It's always the one who finds the body. Probably some old grudge over a goat or a patch of mud. These people have memories like elephants and the morals of alley cats. Hamish watched as the forensic team, huddled in their white suits, began to pick their way across the slippery stones. They looked like oversized penguins and were moving with about as much grace. Jimmy Anderson gave Hamish a sympathetic, weary look as he passed, but said nothing. He knew better than to interrupt Blair when he was in a state of righteous indignation. Blair was currently pacing the harbour, barking orders into a radio and nearly falling into the lock twice. You, Blair barked, spinning back toward Hamish. You're useless here. You've already contaminated the scene with your presence and your mangy dog. Take that flea-bitten beast and go do something constructive. Go door to door. Ask if any person saw a 6-foot Santa Claus wandering around at midnight with a 20-pound fish. Not that I expect you to find anything. You'll probably just end up in someone's kitchen drinking tea and wasting taxpayer money. Get out of my sight before I have you transferred to the traffic division in Glasgow. You can spend your days counting exhaust pipes in the rain. Hamish nodded slowly, resisting the urge to point out that it was already raining, and he was already standing in it. Whatever you say, sir. I'll just be on my way then. I'll see if anyone heard anything. Untoward. Untoward? A man is dead in a Father Christmas suit with a fish in his lap, Macbeth. Everything about this is untoward. Blair turned his back, already dismissing the village policeman as a minor irritation. Hamish whistled softly for Lugs, who emerged from behind a stack of crab pots looking equally unimpressed by the urban invasion. As they walked away from the harbour, leaving the sirens and the lights. The sirens were a dissonant chord against the ancient stoic silence of the mountains, and Hamish was glad to leave them behind. With Lugs trotting at his heels, his tail a determined little flag of defiance against the sleet. Hamish climbed the brae toward the village centre. He knew Blair would be busy for hours, shouting at the forensics team and trying to fit Archie McLean into the shape of a murderer. It was a comfortable, familiar routine. Blair would bully, the forensics would dust for prints that didn't exist, and the real answers would continue to sit quietly in the kitchens and sitting rooms of Lochdu, waiting for someone with the patience to listen. His first port of call was the post office. Mrs. Wellington was already busy at her window, though she wasn't sorting mail. She was watching the harbour through a pair of heavy bird-watching binoculars. When the bell above the door chimed, she didn't even turn around. "He's got him in the back of the car, Hamish," she announced, her voice vibrating with a grim sort of relish. "Blair. He's putting Archie in the back. The man's a fool. Archie McLean couldn't kill a fly without apologising to it first, let alone dress a Sassenach up like St. Nick." Hamish leaned against the counter, feeling the warmth of the small heater begin to thaw his frozen knees. "Hey, Mrs. Wellington, the DCI has a very tidy mind. He likes his killers to be convenient. Now, about that kettle I hear whistling in the back." Mrs. Wellington huffed, but she disappeared into her private quarters and returned a moment later with a large mug of tea and a thick slice of fruitcake. "I suppose you'll be wanting to know who was out and about last night," she said, sliding the plate across the counter. "It would be a help," Hamish mumbled through a mouthful of cake. It was heavy, dark, and tasted of brandy, just the way he liked it. Well, the hotel was busy. A lot of shouting. That Finch Hatton man was telling everyone who would listen that he'd have the new lodges started by January. He had a particular row with Miss Davina, the new schoolmistress. Apparently, the schoolhouse sits right on the edge of where he wanted to put his wellness spa. He told her she'd be looking for a new job by spring. Hamish tucked that piece of information away. Miss Davina was a quiet, bird-like woman who had moved from London to find peace. Threatening her peace was a dangerous game. And the outfit, Mrs. Wellington? Any thoughts on where one might find a Father Christmas suit on short notice? She narrowed her eyes. The church hall, of course. For the children's party tomorrow. It was hanging in the vestry. I saw it there myself when I went to drop off the parish newsletters yesterday afternoon. If it's gone, then someone's been sacrilegious as well as murderous. Hamish finished his tea and gave a polite nod. Sacrilege is often the garnish on the Highland stew, Mrs. Wellington. I'll be seeing you. He stepped back out into the cold, his stomach comfortably weighted by the fruitcake. His next stop was the Lochdu Deli and Curry, run by Mr. Patel. The shop was a sensory anomaly in the Highlands, smelling of cumin, turmeric and damp wool. Mr. Patel was polishing a jar of mango chutney with an intensity that suggested he was trying to rub a hole in the glass. "Bad business, Hamish," Patel said, not looking up. "The big policeman from the city was just in here, demanded my CCTV footage. I told him the wind took the camera down 3 days ago. He called me a shifty local. I found it very offensive. He's a very offensive man, Mr. Patel. It's his primary personality trait. Did Finch Hatton come in here yesterday? He did, to complain. He said the curry was too spicy and that I should cater to refined palates. He also mentioned he was meeting someone at the harbour late last night. A business partner, he called them. He looked nervous, Hamish. Not his usual arrogant self. Nervous? Hamish scratched his chin. That's interesting. Did he say who? No. But he was checking his watch every 30 seconds, and he bought a bottle of mineral water. He said our tap water tasted of peat and misery. Hamish smiled. He had a way with words, didn't he? As he left the shop, Hamish looked toward the church hall. The mystery was beginning to take on a very local shape. A stolen suit, a stolen fish, and a victim who had managed to insult every shopkeeper, schoolteacher, and crofter within a 10-mile radius. Blair was looking for a grand motive, a conspiracy of land rights, or high finance. Hamish, however, was starting to think it was much simpler. In Lochdu, you could get away with a lot of things, but insulting the water and threatening the schoolhouse was a recipe for a very cold, very final Christmas. He began to walk toward the schoolhouse, the sleet turning into a soft, deceptive snow. He needed to speak with Miss Davina, but more importantly, he needed to find out who had access to the hotel's industrial freezer. Because a salmon doesn't just stay frozen in a man's lap by accident, even in a Highland winter. It had to have been kept on ice until the very moment of the performance. And that meant the killer wasn't just angry, they were incredibly patient. He paused by the old stone bridge, looking down at the rushing water of the burn. The dark amber liquid foamed against the rocks, oblivious to the human drama unfolding on its banks. Hamish thought of Finch Hatton's arrogance. The man had arrived like a gale, thinking he could blow over centuries of tradition with the sheer force of his wallet. He hadn't understood that the Highlands didn't fight back with noise, they fought back with silence and time. They waited for you to slip on the ice. They waited for you to walk alone to the harbour at midnight. Blair would never understand that. To Blair, a crime was a puzzle of evidence and shouting. To Hamish, it was a story with a missing sentence. He just had to find the person who was holding their breath, trying not to speak it. Luggs gave a sharp, impatient yip, shaking the melting snow from his coat. "Hey, I'm coming," Hamish muttered. "There's no peace for the wicked, and even less for the police." He adjusted his cap, feeling the dampness seep into the wool, and set off toward the small, ivy-covered schoolhouse. The light in the window was a pale, flickering yellow, like a lonely star in the grey afternoon. It's time to see if Miss Davina's peace was worth killing for. The schoolhouse stood at the very edge of the village, a sturdy little building of grey stone that had weathered a century of Atlantic gales. Its windows were small and deep-set, glowing now with a pale amber light that promised a warmth the exterior cruelly denied. Hamish trudged through the deepening snow, his boots crunching rhythmically on the frozen crust that had formed over the slush. The silence of the glen was absolute, save for the mournful whistle of the wind through the dead larch trees. Just as he reached the rusted iron gate, the low, purring hum of a well-tuned engine broke the stillness. A sleek, silver Volvo crested the rise, its powerful headlights cutting through the swirling gloom like the eyes of a prowling winter beast. It pulled to a smooth halt beside him, and the passenger side window slid down with a soft, expensive hiss that seemed out of place in the rugged Highlands. Priscilla Halberton Smythe looked out at him, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed despite the atmospheric chaos, her blue eyes sparkling with a mixture of amusement and genuine concern. "Hamish," she said, her voice like silk draped over steel. "I might have guessed I'd find you out here in the middle of a blizzard. I've just come from the hotel, where the entire village is in an uproar about that poor man on the slipway. Or should I say, that poor man in the ridiculous red suit. It's all anyone is talking about, even over the bridge games." Hamish leaned against the car door, feeling the blissful warmth radiating from the interior. "Aye, Priscilla. News travels faster than a falcon in Loch Dhu. It's a bad business, and it's only going to get worse once the press gets wind of the Santa outfit." "It's a bizarre business," she corrected, shifting the car into park. "Hop in, Hamish. You're turning a rather alarming shade of blue, and Luggs looks like he's about to become a permanent ice sculpture on the schoolhouse path. I won't have it on my conscience." Hamish hesitated, his heart doing its usual inconvenient thumping dance at the sight of her, but the lure of the car's heater was far too strong to resist. He climbed into the plush passenger seat, Luggs settling onto the floorboards with a grateful shivering groan. The air inside smelled of expensive leather, heated mahogany, and Priscilla's subtle floral perfume, a sharp, dizzying contrast to the damp wool wet dog and peat smoke that usually defined Hamish's world. For a moment he let himself imagine a life where this was his daily reality, but the thought was as fleeting as a snowflake on a hot stove. "I heard Blair is back in his usual form," Priscilla said, her gloved hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. "He's already making a tremendous nuisance of himself at the hotel, accusing the poor chef of hiding murder weapons in the walk-in freezer. He seems convinced the salmon was a personal insult to his authority." "He's a man of limited imagination," Hamish replied, staring out at the blurred white world through the windshield. "He sees a crime and wants a villain he can shout at until they confess. He doesn't understand that in a place like this, the villain is often just someone who was pushed a little too far by a man who didn't know when to stop talking." Priscilla turned to look at him, her expression turning serious, the playful light leaving her eyes. "Jasper Finch Hatton was a man who enjoyed pushing, Hamish. I knew of him in London circles. He was what my father would call frightfully nouveau. He made his fortune in aggressive property acquisitions, often leaving a trail of broken contracts and resentment behind him. But he was also deeply in debt. The eco-lodges weren't a visionary project. They were a desperate gamble to stay ahead of his creditors and the taxman." Hamish's ears pricked up, his detective's instinct overcoming his romantic distraction. A gamble? He told the whole bar he was a visionary bringing progress to the peasants. "A facade," Priscilla said firmly. "He was looking for a partner, someone with local ties to lend his project a veneer of respectability. He approached me, you know. He thought the Halberton Smythe name would open the doors of the local council. I told him I wasn't interested in turning the Glen into a tacky theme park for city dwellers. He didn't take it well at all. He threatened to buy the view out from under us." "Did he mention anyone else?" Hamish asked. "Mr. Patel said he was meeting a partner at the harbour last night, someone he was nervous about." Priscilla frowned, her brow furrowing. "He was seen talking to a man at the Inverness Hunt last month, someone with a reputation for less than savoury business practices. But more importantly, Hamish, you should look into his recent acquisitions. He claimed he had bought the McCrimmon estate, but the paperwork is a mess. There's a rumour that someone else was bidding against him, someone who has a much deeper, older connection to this land than a developer from London, someone who saw his arrival as a desecration." Hamish nodded slowly. The social dynamics Priscilla understood were the invisible threads that held the upper class together. The hidden debts, the fragile reputations, the desperate need to maintain appearances at all costs. To an outsider like Finch Hatton, these threads were merely obstacles to be bulldozed. To a local, they were the fabric of life itself. "You think it wasn't just about the schoolhouse or the harbour?" Hamish asked quietly. "I think Jasper Finch Hatton underestimated the fact that in the Highlands, people don't just own the land owns them," Priscilla said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "And if you try to take it from them, they won't sue you in a London court. They'll wait for a cold night and a long silence." Hamish looked at the schoolhouse again. The light in the window was still there, a small, defiant glow against the encroaching dark. Priscilla's insight hadn't just added a layer of complexity, It had shifted the motive from simple village annoyance to something much more primal and dangerous. He thanked her, the warmth of the car making the prospect of stepping back into the freezing sleet almost unbearable. "Be careful, Hamish," Priscilla whispered as he opened the door. "Blair isn't the only one who might find you an inconvenience if you start looking too closely at the hidden ledgers of the gentry." Hamish gave her a small, lopsided smile that hid his growing unease. "I'm always an inconvenience, Priscilla. It's what I'm best at." He stepped out, the cold hitting him like a physical blow, and watched as the silver car disappeared into the white veil of the storm. He had more than just gossip now, he had a hidden history of desperation. And as he walked toward the schoolhouse door, he wondered if the person inside was a victim of progress, or the architect of a very cold, very silent and ancient revenge. The schoolhouse door creaked open, just as Hamish raised his hand to knock, spilling a rectangle of warm light onto the snow. Miss Davina stood there, her small avian face pinched with anxiety, clutching a thick woolen shawl around her shoulders as if it were armour. "Oh, Hamish," she breathed, her voice trembling like a leaf in a gale. "I heard. The whole village has heard. They say Mr. Finch Hatton is... well, they say he's a Santa Claus now." "Aye, Miss Davina," Hamish said, stepping into the hallway. The air inside was thick with the scent of floor wax and old books, a comforting, nostalgic aroma that felt miles away from the macabre scene at the harbour, a very cold and very dead one. "Priscilla tells me he was making things difficult for you." Davina led him into her small sitting room, where a fire crackled in the grate. He was a monster, Hamish, a polished, expensive monster. "He sat right in that chair 2 days ago and told me that my school was an inefficient use of prime real estate. He said progress required sacrifice, and apparently the education of 12 Highland children was a sacrifice he was willing to make. I told him to leave, but I didn't kill him. I couldn't even kill a spider." Hamish watched her closely. She was twisting a handkerchief between her fingers, her knuckles white. Before he could ask his next question, the peace was shattered by the screech of tyres and the rhythmic thud of car doors being slammed. Hamish looked out the window to see 2 cruisers block the gate. Blair was there, his face a triumphant red, hauling a handcuffed Archie McLean toward the schoolhouse. "Macbeth, get out here!" Blair bellowed, his voice loud enough to rattle the schoolhouse slates. Hamish stepped out onto the porch, Davina hovering fearfully behind him. Blair marched Archie up the path, shoving the old man into the snow. "Found him, Macbeth. Found the killer while you were off playing Lady of the Manor with the Halbert and Smythe girl. Caught him red-handed, I did." "Archie?" Hamish asked, looking at the old fisherman. Archie looked broken, his eyes clouded with a bewildered sort of grief. "I found the belt, Hamish," Blair shouted, waving a wide, black leather belt with a brass buckle. Stashed right under the floorboards of his croft, the missing belt from the Santa suit, and we found a pair of his boots that matched the tread patterns around the body. It's him, a disgruntled local taking out the developer. Open and shut. I'll have him in Strathbane and charged before dinner. The belt, you say?" Hamish drifted down the steps, his eyes narrowing. He looked at the belt in Blair's hand, then at Archie's shivering form, then at Archie's dog, a collie named Bess, who was sniffing Blair's trousers. "Hey, the belt! What are you staring at, you great lummox?" Hamish reached out and touched the leather. It was bone dry. It was also remarkably clean, considering the slushy, muddy chaos of the harbour last night. "Tell me, sir," Hamish said softly, his Highland lilt thickening, "if Archie here killed the man at the harbour, in the middle of a sleet storm, and tied him up with this belt, why is the leather so supple? And why is there no salt spray on the buckle?" Blair scoffed. "He wiped it down. He's a devious one, these crofters." Hamish ignored him and knelt in the snow. He looked at Archie's feet. Archie was wearing his old, cracked leather work boots. Then Hamish looked at the belt again. He noticed a small, distinct tuft of white fur caught in the buckle. Not nylon from the beard, but actual animal fur. "Archie," Hamish said quietly, "where's your cat? The big white one, Snowy." "Snowy? Why, he's been dead these 3 years, Hamish, you know that. I haven't had a cat since." Hamish stood up, a cold realization dawning on him. He looked at Blair. "The belt wasn't in Archie's cottage, was it, sir? Not until someone put it there. Because this fur doesn't belong to a cat. It's Angora. High-end, expensive Angora wool, the kind you'd find on a lady's evening wrap. And look at the holes, sir. This belt has been cinched tight for a long time on someone with a much larger waist than Archie's. Archie's a slip of a man. If he'd been using this belt, he'd have had to punch a new hole with his knife. There's no new hole. This belt was planted. Blair's face went from purple to a mottled grey. Planted? Who would plant it? Someone who knew you'd be looking for a local scapegoat, Hamish interrupted. Someone who has a white Angora wrap and a reason for us not to look at the hotel guest list too closely. Hamish looked past Blair toward the village. The red herring was vivid, but it was starting to stink. Blair had the wrong man. As Hamish watched the snow fall, he realized the real suspect had dressed the crime scene specifically for Blair's benefit. "Take the cuffs off him, sir," Hamish said, his tone no longer vacuous but sharp. "Unless you want the Strathbane Herald to hear about how you arrested a man for a murder committed with a belt he couldn't possibly fit into." Blair fumed, but the logic was undeniable. He signalled Anderson to release the old man. As Archie was freed, Hamish caught a glimpse of something else, a small, dark smudge on the back of the belt buckle. It wasn't mud, it was a smear of expensive, plum-coloured lipstick, the same shade he'd seen on a glass back at the hotel bar. The investigation wasn't leading to the Crofts, it was heading straight back to the upper-class suites of the Whodunit Hotel. Hamish watched Blair storm off, his heart heavy. The trap had been clumsy, but the intent was clear. Someone wanted Archie to take the fall, and that someone was currently sipping gin while the village burned. He needed to find that lipstick, and he needed to find it before the snow covered the tracks leading to the real killer's door. This wasn't just a village feud. It was a cold-blooded assassination, meticulously staged to frame a man whose only crime was loving his land too much. The Highlands were full of ghosts, and today one of them had a distinct, expensive scent of desperation. Hamish turned back toward the dark, shivering schoolhouse, certain that the answers lay not in the snow, but in the secrets held tight by those who thought they were simply too clever for the local law to ever catch the door. The snow was no longer a gentle dusting. It had become a thick, silent blanket that swallowed the sounds of the village, turning Whodunit into a ghostly white landscape. Hamish watched the heavy oak door of the schoolhouse swing shut, leaving him once more in the blue, grey twilight of the Highland afternoon. Lugs gave a sharp, disapproving sneeze as a clump of snow fell from a branch onto his nose. "I know, Lugs," Hamish whispered, his breath a pale plume in the freezing air. "The world is a cold place, and it's getting colder for someone in this village." He didn't follow Blair's patrol car. Instead, he took the long way back to the Whodunit Hotel, cutting through the narrow alleyways between the cottages where the wind couldn't reach. He was thinking about the plum-coloured lipstick and the Angora fur. Those weren't the hallmarks of a disgruntled fisherman or a panicked schoolmistress. They were the accessories of a woman who cared about her image, even in the middle of a Highland winter. When he entered the hotel, the transition from the Arctic chill to the sweltering heat of the lobby was almost dizzying. The fireplace was roaring, fed by logs the size of small trees, and the air was thick with the scent of pine needles and expensive tobacco. DCI Blair was slumped at the far end of the bar, nursing a double whiskey and radiating a black mood that kept even the most curious villagers at a distance. Hamish didn't approach him. Instead, he drifted toward the small residence lounge, a room filled with overstuffed chintz chairs and the quiet hum of high society boredom. Sitting by the window, ostensibly reading a thick biography of a forgotten Duke, was Mrs. Millicent Hedge. She was a guest who had arrived shortly before Finch Hatton, a woman of indeterminate middle age with a voice like honey and a manner that was relentlessly, almost aggressively helpful. She had spent the morning bringing tea to the weary forensic team and providing helpful observations about how strange the local people seemed. Hamish sat on a low stool near the hearth, ostensibly to warm his hands. He didn't look at her directly, but he watched her reflection in the dark, polished wood of a nearby sideboard. "A terrible day, Mrs. Hedge," he said, his voice a slow, sleepy drawl. "First the murder, and then the snow. It's enough to make a person wish they'd stayed in London." Mrs. Hedge lowered her book, her face a mask of polite concern. "It is truly dreadful, Officer Macbeth. This poor, peaceful village. I was just saying to the landlord that it feels like something out of a Gothic novel. And that poor man, to be treated so irreverently after death. It suggests a very primitive sort of mind, don't you think? Hamish leaned forward, poking at a stray ember with the brass tongs. Aye, primitive. Or perhaps just very angry. You see, the funny thing is the Santa suit. It's a lot of work, isn't it? Dressing a dead man. It's not about the killing. It's about the humiliation. It's about making sure everyone knows he was a fool. He paused, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. I found a bit of fur today. White Angora. Very soft, very expensive. The kind you'd see on a wrap, or perhaps the lining of a very fine coat. Mrs. Hedge's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on the edge of her book. How interesting. I suppose one of the locals must have a fancy for such things. Perhaps, Hamish said, finally turning to look at her. His green eyes were no longer vacant. They were sharp and searching. But then there was the lipstick. A very specific shade. Plum. It's not a colour you see much in Whodunit. The ladies here prefer a sensible pink or nothing at all. But I noticed a glass on your table last night, Mrs. Hedge. It had a smudge of that very same plum on the rim. The helpful mask didn't slip, but the air around her seemed to grow as cold as the loch. She laughed, a brittle tinkling sound. Really, officer? You think a lipstick smudge is a clue? I'm sure half the women in the country wear that shade. Maybe, Hamish replied, standing up slowly. But not many of them were seen arguing with Jasper Finch Hatton in the hotel garden at 3 a.m, and not many of them would have known about the Santa suit in the vestry. You've been very active in the church committee since you arrived, haven't you? Helping with the decorations? The realization hit Hamish then, as clear as the winter moon. This wasn't about land or eco-lodges. Finch Hatton hadn't been a visionary or even a successful developer. He had been a predator. He'd been using his development projects as a front for something much older, blackmail. Priscilla had mentioned his debts. He wasn't just staying ahead of creditors, he was collecting secrets to pay them off. And Mrs. Hedge, with her perfect manners and her expensive Angora, had a secret that was worth a great deal more than a patch of Highland bog. The motive wasn't the land, it was the ledger. Finch Hatton had been holding something over her, something that would have ruined her life in the polite circles she inhabited. The murder was a desperate act of self-preservation, and the Santa suit was her final, spiteful revenge on the man who had tried to play her like a puppet. Hamish looked at her, seeing the desperation behind the polished exterior. She wasn't a monster, just a woman who had been pushed into a corner by a man who didn't understand the local terrain. She had tried to use Blair's incompetence to her advantage, planting the belt to lead him toward the most obvious target. She had underestimated the stupid policeman who sat quietly and listened to the things people didn't say. I think, Hamish said softly, that I'll be needing to have a look at your luggage, Mrs. Hedge. Not that I'm an expert on fashion, mind you, but I'd hate for DCI Blair to find that Angora wrap before I do. He's a very loud man, and he has a terrible habit of making a scene in front of the other guests. Mrs. Hedge stared at him, her face finally crumbling into a look of cold, calculating hatred. She knew the game was changing. The quiet village policeman wasn't mooching tea anymore. He was closing the door. Hamish turned his back on her, walking toward the bar where Blair was still shouting at a bewildered waiter. He needed to set the final trap, and for that, he would need the DCI's particular brand of noisy, arrogant distraction. The stage was set for the final act, and the snow continued to fall, burying the secrets of Whodunit 1 inch at a time. He could almost taste the stew waiting for him back at the station, but there was one more piece of theatre to perform before the night was through. He caught Blair's eye and began to walk over, his face once again a mask of slow-witted, apologetic confusion. It was time to give the DCI exactly what he wanted, a glorious public victory that would keep Hamish exactly where he wanted to be. Hamish crossed the threshold from the quiet, chilling tension of the residence lounge into the rowdy, overheated atmosphere of the main bar, with the practiced ease of a man stepping onto a familiar stage. The transition was physical, the heavy scent of spilled ale, wood smoke, and the damp, steaming wool of several dozen villagers hit him like a solid wall. DCI Blair was still perched on his bar stool, his tie loosened and his collar stained with sweat, looking for all the world like a bull that had been lured into a china shop and then told it couldn't break anything. Jimmy Anderson sat beside him, staring into a glass of ginger ale with the profound melancholy of a man who realized his pension was still 20 years away. Hamish adjusted his cap, wiped a bead of condensation from his upper lip, and assumed the look of a man who had recently been hit over the head with a very large, very confusing cabbage. It was his most effective disguise, the mask of the simple Highland bobby who found the world much too fast and complicated for his liking. "Sir," Hamish said, leaning over the bar and projecting his voice just enough to carry over the low thrum of village gossip. He made sure to glance nervously back toward the lounge where Mrs. Hedge was undoubtedly still sitting, her ears strained like a fox's. "I've come to apologise. I'm afraid I've made a bit of a mess of things, as you predicted." Blair turned slowly, his eyes bloodshot and narrow. "Only a bit, Macbeth. You've spent the day protecting a fish-obsessed crofter and wandering around like a lost sheep. What is it now? Have you lost your handcuffs, or did the dog eat your notebook?" He let out a harsh, barking laugh that caused several locals to duck their heads into their pints. "It's about the car, sir. Finch Hatton's car," Hamish whispered, loud enough to be heard 3 tables away. "I was checking the glove compartment, I know I shouldn't have without your leave, and I found a small black notebook. A ledger, I think. It had all sorts of names in it, some very important names, and numbers. Lots of numbers followed by pound signs. It looked like a list of people who owed him money for keeping quiet." Blair's expression shifted instantly from derision to a sharp, predatory greed. The prospect of a high-profile blackmail case, with its potential for career-making headlines in the city papers, was like a scent of blood to a shark. "A ledger? Where is it? Give it here, you idiot!" Hamish shuffled his feet, looking down at his boots with an expression of profound guilt. "That's the trouble, sir. With the snow coming down so hard, and the hotel being so full of, strangers, I didn't feel safe carrying it. I thought someone might try to take it off me. So I took it up to the schoolhouse. Miss Davina has that old Victorian deed box with the heavy iron lock. I told her to put it in there, and not to open the door to anyone but me or you, sir. I thought it was best to keep it on neutral ground until the morning when the roads are cleared." "You did what?" Blair roared, half rising from his stool. "You left a vital piece of evidence in the hands of a schoolmarm? In a building that hasn't got a proper lock on the front gate? Macbeth, you are a walking disaster. You've basically put a rob me sign on the most important document in this entire investigation." "I thought it was clever, sir," Hamish moped, looking thoroughly dejected. "Nobody would think to look for a blackmailer's secrets in a primary school, would they? It's tucked right behind the shelf of geography textbooks. I'm going back there now to stand guard, though the wind is that fierce I doubt I'll make it through the drifts." "No, you aren't," Blair snapped, his mind already racing. "You're going to sit in that corner and stay out of the way. Anderson and I will handle the ledger. But not yet. Let the village settle. If we go charging up there now, we'll start a riot. We'll go at midnight once the bar closes and these peasants are in bed." Blair turned back to his whiskey, a smug, self-satisfied grin spreading across his face. He was already drafting the press release in his head. Hamish nodded obediently and slunk off to a dark corner table where Luggs was waiting patiently. He didn't order a drink. Instead, he watched the reflection in the window. He saw Mrs. Hedge rise from her chair in the lounge, her movements fluid and hurried. She didn't look toward the bar. She went straight to the cloakroom, and a moment later, the side door of the hotel clicked shut. The trap was baited. Hamish knew that if Mrs. Hedge was the killer, and he was as sure of it as he was of the sunrise, she couldn't afford to let that ledger survive the night. She wouldn't wait for Blair. She would go now, under the cover of the blizzard, thinking she was outsmarting both the shouting city detective and the lazy village policeman. "Wait here, Luggs," Hamish whispered, patting the dog's head. He didn't take the main road. He slipped out through the hotel kitchen, nodding to a distracted Rory, and vanished into the white wall of the storm. He had no coat this time, only his uniform and a heavy flashlight, but the cold didn't matter now. The adrenaline of the hunt had finally taken hold. He knew the shortcuts through the heather that even the snow couldn't hide. He would be at the schoolhouse long before the lady in the Angora wrap arrived, and he would be waiting in the shadows of the geography shelf to see just how far a desperate woman would go to keep her secrets buried. The game was no longer about gossip. It was about the final, frantic move of a cornered predator. The snow swirled around him, a freezing shroud that hid his path, but Hamish Macbeth moved with the quiet, unerring certainty of a man who was finally, truly home in his element. He reached the schoolhouse fence just as a flickering light appeared at the far end of the brae, a single desperate torch beam cutting through the dark. The killer was coming, and the silence of the Highlands was about to be broken for the very last time. He crouched low beside the stone wall, his eyes fixed on the approaching shadow, waiting for the moment the trap would finally spring shut. The air inside the schoolhouse was even colder than the gale outside, a stagnant, biting frost that seemed to have seeped directly out of the cold stone walls. Hamish was perched uncomfortably on one of the small wooden chairs, his long legs tucked up toward his chin, making him feel like an overgrown grasshopper. He had instructed Miss Davina to lock herself upstairs and not to come down even if the Highland hills fell into the sea. The light came from lightning that illuminated the rows of small desks and the large dusty map of the entire world. He waited in the absolute pitch dark, his ears straining past the biting wind for the metallic click of the front door's heavy iron latch. It came even sooner than he had expected. There was a faint, rhythmic scraping, the sound of someone brushing snow off their boots, followed by the protest of the heavy oak door as it was forced against the wind. A thin sliver of pale light from a pocket torch cut through the gloom, dancing over the chalky blackboard. The figure moved with speed and a total lack of the helpful hesitation Mrs. Hedge had displayed at the hotel. She was wearing a heavy coat, but as she moved, the torchlight caught the shimmering white fringe of the expensive white angora wrap she had tightly tucked around her throat. It looked like a coil of predatory silk in the dark. She went straight for the shelf of geography textbooks, her movements frantic and precise. She shoved aside a volume on topography, her breath coming in short gasps that hissed in the silent room. Her hand struck the metal of the deed box containing nothing but an old telephone directory and a small handful of porridge oats. As she fumbled with the lid, her torch rolling across a desk and casting long and distorted shadows against the ceiling, Hamish decided it was time to end the long winter night's performance. "It's a heavy thing to be carrying in a storm, Mrs. Hedge," Hamish said, his voice low and steady, lacking any of its lilt. He didn't turn on his own light. He let the darkness do the work of unnerving her. The woman let out a strangled cry, spinning around so fast she knocked the deed box to the floor with a resounding clang. She swept the torch beam across the room until it landed on Hamish's face. He didn't blink. He sat there, a tall, grim silhouette of the law, his green eyes reflecting the light with a cold intensity. "You," she hissed, the honey sweet. Tone replaced by a rasping venom. "You stupid ginger-haired animal. You don't know what you're doing. That man was a parasite. He was going to destroy everything I've built, my reputation, my family's name. He lived on the blood of people like me. He was a blackmailer, aye," Hamish agreed, rising slowly from the tiny chair, "and a nasty piece of work. But the law in Whodunit doesn't give a discount for killing parasites, even if you dress them up like Father Christmas. You thought that by making it look like a village prank or joke, the police would look at the crofters. You thought Blair would be too angry and busy shouting at Archie MacLean to notice a lady with a dark, plum-coloured secret." Mrs. Hedge reached into the deep pocket of her coat, her face contorting into a mask of pure, aristocratic and cold rage. "I won't go back to a cell. Not for a creature like Finch Hatton." She pulled out a small, lethal, silver-plated derringer, the barrel glinting sharply in the torchlight. It was a toy-like weapon, but at this range, it was more than capable of ending Hamish's long-suffering police career permanently. Hamish didn't hesitate. For all his deceptive laziness, he moved with the startling grace of a starving Highland wildcat. Before the woman could level the small pistol, he had cleared the distance. He caught her wrist in a grip of iron, twisting it upward, just as the gun discharged with a sharp crack that shattered a jar of specimens on the high, dark wooden shelf. Hamish used his weight to pin her against the desk, his breath hot in the freezing air. He forced the gun from her hand, hearing it clatter away. As she struggled, she managed to kick him squarely in the shin, making him grunt. He twisted her arms behind her back, the struggle a clumsy tangle of limbs and wet wool. Finally, he clicked the handcuff shut. The arrest was messy, loud and effective. Millicent Hedge slumped against the mahogany desk, her expensive angora wrap torn and her dignity finally destroyed. He stood over her, his red, unruly hair a wild halo in the flashing torchlight. The silence that followed the gunshot was more jarring than the explosion itself, a thick, suffocating vacuum that seemed to swallow the very air in the schoolroom. Hamish stood over the shattered remains of a specimen jar, a preserved newt now lying amidst shards of glass and formaldehyde, and felt a dull ache in his shin where Mrs. Hedge's heel had connected. He didn't move for a long moment, watching the way the torchlight played across the metallic silver of the derringer on the floor. Mrs. Hedge was no longer a terrifying assassin. She was merely a crumpled, middle-aged woman in a ruined coat, her breathing a series of ragged, wet sobs that echoed against the wooden desks. Above them, the floorboards creaked. Miss Davina appeared at the top of the stairs, her face as white as the snowdrifts outside, clutching a heavy brass candlestick as if she intended to use it. "Hamish?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. Is it over?" "It's over, Miss Davina," Hamish said, his voice regaining its usual deceptive softness. "Just a bit of a localized thunderclap. You stay right there." He bent down, using a clean handkerchief to pick up the silver pistol, his mind already racing ahead to the most dangerous part of the evening, the arrival of DCI Blair. He knew the sirens would be here soon, the gunshot would have carried to the village, and Blair's ego would have brought him to the schoolhouse eventually. Just as he predicted, the darkness outside was suddenly carved into pieces by the blue and red flashes of police lights. 2 cars slewed to a halt at the gate, and the sounds of heavy boots on the porch signalled the end of Hamish's brief moment of competence. The door was kicked open with a violence that made the windows rattle, and DCI Blair burst in, followed by a shivering Jimmy Anderson. Blair's face was a map of indignant fury, his eyes darting from the handcuffed woman to the shattered specimen jar, and finally to Hamish, who was currently trying to look as if he had just accidentally tripped over a criminal. "Macbeth!" Blair roared, his voice bouncing off the maps of the world. "What the hell is going on? I told you to stay in the corner. I told you I was handling this." He marched forward, his gaze landing on Mrs. Hedge. "Who is this? And why is she in handcuffs? If you've arrested a guest for no reason, I'll have your badge and your scrawny neck for a tie." Hamish assumed a look of profound, wide-eyed relief, almost stumbling toward the DCI. "Oh, thank goodness you're here, sir. It was just as you suspected. I don't know how you saw it so clearly, but your theory about the sophisticated city killer was exactly right. I was just sitting here, trying to remember what you'd said about the hotel freezer and the plum lipstick, when this lady burst in with a gun. If I hadn't been following the brilliant breadcrumbs you laid out at the bar, I'd never have known to wait here. I was just the bait, sir, just as you planned it." Blair paused, his mouth hanging open for a second, as his brain scrambled to catch up with the narrative Hamish was feeding him. He looked at Mrs. Hedge, then at the gun in the handkerchief, and then back at Hamish. The greed for glory began to win its internal war against his natural suspicion. "My theory?" Blair repeated, his voice dropping an octave as he smoothed his tie. "Ah, yes, the lipstick, and the freezer. Of course. You see, Anderson, I told you the local element was a distraction. I knew the moment I saw that Father Christmas suit that we were dealing with someone who understood the psychological impact of a theatrical crime." "It was masterful, sir," Hamish continued, bowing his head in a show of humble subservience. "Especially the way you let her think Archie was the suspect to draw her out. I only managed to get the cuffs on her because she was so rattled by the trap you'd set. She even tried to shoot me, sir. If you hadn't taught me that defensive manoeuvre back in Strathbane, I'd be a dead man. It'll make a grand report for the Chief Constable. DCI Blair's high-stakes sting operation in the Highlands. They'll probably want to put your picture in the national papers." Blair's chest began to swell, his face turning from a hostile purple to a smug, self-satisfied pink. "Well, yes. One does what one must, Macbeth. It's a matter of experience, seeing the hidden connections. Anderson, get the woman to the car, and make sure that weapon is tagged as evidence in the DCI's name." The morning light was a cold, surgical white that made the fresh snow on the peaks of the Monadleith Mountains sparkle like crushed diamonds. The storm had retreated, leaving behind a world so still and silent that the crunch of a single boot could be heard across the loch. In the car park of the Lochdu Hotel, DCI Blair was in his element. A photographer from the Strathbane Herald had arrived, and Blair was currently striking a pose next to the police van, where a silent, shuttered Millicent Hedge was being held. He had tucked his chin into his collar to look more formidable, and was pointing vaguely toward the hills as if he had personally wrestled the truth from the very granite itself. Jimmy Anderson stood in the background, nursing a paper cup of lukewarm coffee, his expression one of profound, resigned exhaustion. He caught Hamish's eye and gave a subtle, weary nod, the silent acknowledgement of one man who had done the work to another who would never get the praise. Pure instinct, Anderson, Blair boomed, his voice carrying clearly to where Hamish stood by the hotel's stone gate. I saw the lipstick on the glass and the way she flinched when I mentioned the word ledger. It takes a city mind to see through these rural distractions. Macbeth here was useful for holding the light, I suppose, but it was the Strathbane CID that closed the net. Make sure the superintendent knows that I personally supervised the schoolhouse intervention. It was a high-risk manoeuvre, but I wasn't about to let a killer slip through my fingers just because of a bit of Highland weather. Hamish stood with his hands deep in his greatcoat pockets, his face a masterpiece of blank-eyed, simple-minded admiration. It was like watching a hawk, sir, Hamish added, his Highland lilt thick and syrupy. The way you lured her out, I would have never thought a lady like that could be so devious, but you saw right through the Angora wrap. Blair snorted, adjusted his tie, and climbed into the lead car without a backward glance. The small convoy began its slow, cautious descent down the icy road, sirens silent, but the air of self-importance trailing behind them like exhaust fumes. As the last car disappeared around the bend, the tension that had gripped Loch Dhu for the last 48 hours seemed to evaporate into the thin, crisp air. The village was theirs again. Archie MacLean drifted over from the harbour, his hands shoved into his oilskins. He looked at Hamish, his old eyes shrewd and knowing. "He's a loud man, that Blair," Archie muttered, spitting a dark stream of tobacco juice into the pristine snow. "A very loud, very stupid man. We all know who did the thinking, Hamish. We all know who kept me out of a cell in Strathbane. I'll no be forgetting it." "Aye, well," Hamish said, looking at the grey waters of the loch. "I'm just glad it's over, Archie. It's bad for the digestion, all this excitement. And besides, if Blair thinks he's the hero, he'll leave us in peace for a while. That's worth more than a mention in the papers." Hamish walked back toward his cottage, Lugs trotting happily at his heels, the dog seemingly aware that the danger had passed. He felt a profound sense of relief. Had he taken the credit, the chief constable would have been on the phone by noon, talking about promotions, a desk in Inverness, and a career in special investigations. The thought of sitting in a windowless office, surrounded by filing cabinets and the endless roar of traffic, was enough to make Hamish break into a cold sweat. By letting Blair play the hero, Hamish had bought himself another season of quiet, of poaching the occasional salmon, and of being exactly where he belonged. Inside the police cottage, the peat stove was still warm. Hamish shed his heavy coat and set a fresh pot of coffee on the burner. He sat at the pine table and pulled a small, crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. It was the list of people Finch Hatton had been blackmailing, a list he hadn't told Blair about. It contained names that would have set the Highlands on fire, a lord, a local councillor, and several prominent businessmen. With a flick of his wrist, Hamish tossed the paper into the heart of the fire. He watched the edges curl and blacken, the secrets of the dead man turning into harmless grey ash. Justice had been served in its own messy Highland way. Mrs. Hedge would go to prison for the murder, and the people she had been blackmailed alongside would be free to live their lives, provided they didn't cross the line again. He thought of the salmon that had been the centrepiece of the crime. Mrs. Hedge had stolen it from the hotel's industrial freezer, a fish Rory had been saving for the Christmas gala, and used it to mock the man who had tried to ruin her. It was a clever touch, using a local symbol to frame a local man. But she hadn't accounted for the fact that a truly local man would notice the lack of salt spray on a belt, or the particular shade of a city woman's lipstick. Hamish poured himself a mug of coffee, the steam rising in the quiet kitchen. He looked out the window at the village, peaceful once more under its white shroud. The Sassenach developer was gone, the Sassenach killer was in custody, and the Highland peasant was exactly where he wanted to be. He leaned back in his chair, the warmth of the stove seeping into his bones. "Well, Lugs," Hamish murmured, the dog resting his head on Hamish's boot. "It's nearly Christmas, and I believe that salmon in the coal shed is just about ready for the pot." He closed his eyes, a small, sceptical smile playing on his lips, listening to the magnificent golden silence of Loch Dhu.